name's Todd Miranda, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to control video playback in a WPF application. So let's begin in Microsoft Visual Studio 2008. We'll choose File, New, Project, and we'll choose a WPF application targeting the .NET Framework 3.5. We'll name it accordingly and choose OK. So that's going to create our default WPF template. Alright, so before we begin building our actual UI, let's add a video to the project. Since we're going to be controlling video, we're obviously going to need a video. So let's choose Project, Add Existing Item, and let's just go to the Public folder and we'll go to Public Videos. We'll choose a sample video. We'll choose All Files so we can see the videos, and we'll do Add. I'm just going to add the butterfly video. And one of the first things that we need to do when we add video to the project is let's go to Copy Output Directory and specify that we can copy always. That means that the WMV file or the video file will be copied to the output directory each time we do a build. And that way we make sure that the video file is in the output directory so we can use relative paths as our source for our media element. It's just a little bit easier to access the video that way as opposed to having to create a longer URI path. Okay, so let's begin by laying out our UI. And we're going to have a simple UI. We're going to use our grid, and we're going to add row definitions to our grid. We're going to have two rows. The top row will house the video, and the bottom row will house a little row of buttons that we can use to control our video. So let's do a row definition inside of our grid.row definitions, and we're going to specify the height of this first row. We're going to use this relative height syntax for WPF, and this is going to be 2*, and that effectively says, well, let's put the second row down here first, and then we'll take a look at how these relate. So if we do something like this, effectively what this syntax says is the second or the first row is going to be twice the height of the second row. So this is a 2-to-1 ratio of the proportion of the rows within the grid. So the first row is going to be twice as big as the second row, and then let WPF figure that out based on how big the actual grid is. Alright, so since we're going to play video, we need to have a media element. So we're going to add a media element. We're going to give it a name, as is good practice. We'll just call this My Media. And then we're going to specify that this media element lives in the first row. Okay, so far so good. Now let's go for our second row. And our second row is just going to be a stack panel. And our stack panel will say lives in the second row. This is 0 base, so the second row is index of 1. We're going to say that its orientation is horizontal and its horizontal alignment is center. So we're just going to center it right in the middle of the grid. So within our stack panel we're going to have some buttons. So let's create a button, and we're going to give these buttons names. Good practice to always give your buttons names. So this is obviously going to be button play. We need a play button, and we'll specify that as play. And then we've got another button, and its name is button, say, pause. And we've got another button. Obviously I could have copied and pasted these, it would have been a little bit faster. Resume. And finally, now that I'm almost done, we'll copy and paste, and we'll have a stop button. Alright, so there's our button. Now, since we want to control the video playback, instead of just using the media element and setting its source equal to the video, we actually want to control the timeline across which the video plays. So anytime that you want to manipulate the video or even audio when you're using media element, the video or audio timeline, and manipulate where it is, when it starts and stops, and move its position along that timeline, we need to introduce a media timeline. And a media timeline is an element that's put inside of a storyboard that allows you to manipulate that. So you can think of, if you think about it, the media timeline inside a storyboard, it's like an animation. It's a type of animation. We're animating, because if you remember in WPF, animations are really nothing more than the variation of a property value over time. That's, in a nutshell, that's what an animation is. So a media timeline allows us to set the position of the playhead of a media element in time. So we need to add a storyboard. So we've got to figure out where we're going to add this storyboard. In our particular case, we could do it in the window.resources, in the grid. We're going to do it in the stack panel. That keeps everything local to where the buttons are. Since the buttons are going to be the actual triggers for our storyboard, we'll just put them down here. It localizes them to the stack panel, and we don't really need to access them outside of the scope of the stack panel. So we're going to come into our stack panel, and we're going to create some triggers in our stack panel. And we're going to do an event trigger. And the routed event that we're going to look for is a button click event. And now we have to tell it where that button click event is coming from. So we're going to specify the source name, or the source of that button click. And the source for this one is going to be play. Alright, so there's our event trigger on button click of the button play button. Then we want to come in here and do event trigger dot action. So these are what's going to happen when this trigger or when this event is triggered. And inside of there, we're going to do a begin storyboard. Now we're going to give this storyboard a name, and the reason why is we want to interact with this storyboard and this media timeline from other events as well. So we're going to say anytime we want to interact with something outside of itself, we give it a name so we can reference it by name. Alright, so there's our begin storyboard, and we'll just call this begin video is the name of our begin storyboard. And a begin storyboard takes a storyboard, kind of makes sense, and this is where we're going to house our media timeline. So let's use media timeline. Now we're going to specify the source. This is where we specify the source of our video, and this is because we want the video to be controlled by this media timeline, not necessarily by the media element. However, a media timeline is not a visual element, so we still have to have the media element to play that video. So for our media timeline, we do a storyboard.target name, and we specify the name of the media element that's actually going to be playing that video. So that's it. There's our media timeline, the source of the timeline, and the storyboard.target name is the target of the video, which is going to be the my media element. Well, that's play. The play button is done. But now we don't need to repeat this media timeline for each event. As a matter of fact, that would be a problem because we need to control the timeline in one place and have other events just interact with that. So in order to handle that, we want to go down and create another event trigger. So we're going to create another event trigger. Its routed event is still going to be button.click. However, its source name is going to be button pause. And obviously we have some actions that are going to happen when this event is triggered. Now, just like we have a media timeline element that we can use to control the timeline, we have some nice elements to make it easier to interact with that timeline, and these are event type storyboard interactivity elements, if you will. And since this is our pause button, we're going to use a pause storyboard element. Now what we need to do is we need to tell it what storyboard that we're talking about. So it's going to say, what is the begin storyboard name? And you might think that why isn't this storyboard name? Well, since we're inside of these event triggers in the actual XAML, we're going to be interacting with the begin storyboard, which is the action of the first event. So we're gonna interface at this level. So we say begin storyboard name equals begin video. And that's pretty much it. Now we'll just copy this, and we want to respond to another button click event, but this button click event will be the button resume. And if you hadn't guessed already, we have a resume storyboard. And last but not least, we have our button stop, and yes, there is a stop storyboard. Okay, so let's review. We created our UI framework with our grid. We added a media element, didn't set its source. Then we added a stack panel for our buttons. Now somewhere we chose to put it in our stack panel, but you could put this at the grid level. Since it's a routed event, it's just gonna be routed up the chain. So you could put it at the grid and it would get all the way up to the grid, or you could put it at the window. It would get all the way up to the window. We stopped it right here at the stack panel because all of our buttons are in the stack panel. So there's no sense to have that event routed any further before we respond to it. So we have an event trigger on the click event of our play button, and that caused a begin storyboard element to kick off, and the storyboard was made up of a media timeline who was sourced with our video and who targeted our media element as the player of that video. And then we included some other event triggers as well, one for each of the other buttons: pause, resume, and stop, and each one of those called in their actions property the corresponding storyboard element: pause, resume, or stop storyboard. Alright, well, let's save this and build it and see if we've introduced any errors. Alright, well, our build succeeded, so let's just try to run it. Okay, so here's our window with our buttons down at the bottom. So we click on the play button, and our video gets loaded and starts playing. We click on pause, video pauses, obviously. We click on resume, and the video resumes from that point. Now if we click on stop, it's going to stop the video. If we click on resume at this point, there's really nothing to resume because we did a stop, we didn't do a pause. So at this point we could click play to start the video over again and start it playing, and we can pause and resume as much as we'd like there, or stop it altogether. So, fairly easy to control the playback of the video. One of the important things to remember is that when you're doing all this within your XAML and you want to create your event triggers to have the buttons stop and start and pause your video, remember that you're using a media timeline. And that's because you're not wanting to affect the player container. That's the media element. The media element is the element that contains the player for the video. What you're wanting to do is you're wanting to affect the timeline of that video. So it's a good way to just to remember that when you want to do this kind of control using events and things like buttons or whatever you'd like to do to control that, you want to use the media timeline and then interact with that media timeline in its storyboard element.